One of the questions our customers most frequently ask us is, what's involved in a remote start installation? We've prepared this video to give you a general idea of what a remote start installation entails from start to finish. Every vehicle is different, so the specific connections you'll need to make will vary. This video will give you a general idea of what's involved. Whenever you purchase a remote start from mypushcart.com, we give you access to our tip sheet database. Tip sheets give very specific information on installing the remote start you purchased into your specific vehicle. We also include a wiring chart, again specific to your vehicle, that shows the color and location of all the wires you'll need to access. All remote start packages from mypushcart.com include all the components you need for installation: a bypass module, any relays or adapters that are needed, and the remote start itself. Here's an example of the basic tools you may need for your installation. Unpack your components: the brain, the remote controls, and the wiring harnesses. The first step of the installation is to prepare the harnesses. It's easier to do this on your workbench than when you're inside the vehicle. A lot of the wires that you see in the box will not be needed. Here's where you refer to your tip sheet. It will tell you which wires you'll be using and which wires you won't be using. Separate off the wires that you won't be using. Next, plug in your LED, the antenna wire, the valet switch, and the door lock harness plug. Note that on Crime Stopper remote starts there are two 3-pin plugs. The correct plug for the door locks is the one with the white connector. Now that everything's plugged into the brain, tape up the harnesses so that everything is nice and neat. The wires we're not using are still separated, and I'm going to leave them out of the bundle. Make sure your fuses remain accessible. The next step is to prep the bypass harness. In almost all installations, only a fraction of the wires in the bypass harness are used. Refer to your tip sheet. It will show you which wires to use and which ones to trim. In this installation, we're only using 3 wires out of the main harness. That's not uncommon. Now that the prep work is done, it's time to get access to the wires in the vehicle. In most vehicles, the majority of your wiring will be done in the area underneath the steering column. Most vehicles will have a combination of clips and screws that hold the lower dash panel into place. Remove the screws, and when removing the clips, be sure to pull gently so as to not break the panels. Sometimes screws are hidden, so be sure to check carefully before pulling on the panels. Some installations will also require removal of the steering column cover. In most vehicles, your main power connections will be made at the ignition switch harness. This includes the main power input, the starter wire, the ignition wire, and the accessory wires. Your vehicle wiring chart will identify the colors of those wires, but you should always verify them using a voltometer. Here's a great example of how to use the wiring chart in your tip sheet. The wiring chart for this vehicle tells us that the main 12-volt wire is white, the accessory wire is red, the second accessory wire is orange, the ignition wire is blue, the starter wire is yellow, and that they're all located in the ignition switch harness. We've located the ignition switch harness, we've located those wires, and now we'll just test and verify them. The best way to make wiring connections in a vehicle is to solder and tape, but that's not always feasible. We've provided T-taps with your kit, which allow the do-it-yourself installer to make reliable connections. Put a T-tap onto each of the wires that you'll be using. Refer to your tip sheet to see which ones they are. Use a pair of pliers to pinch them until the locking tab engages. Make sure the T-tap is secure. Now that we've put taps on all of the wires we'll be using in the ignition harness, we'll locate the rest of the wires we'll need for the installation. For remote starts with keyless entry, the door lock wires are typically located in the kick panel. Refer to your wiring chart for the exact location and colors. In this vehicle, the door lock wires are blue and pink. We're also going to put a tap on the gray wire, which is the OEM alarm disarm wire. This will automatically disarm your factory alarm when you engage the remote start. We've also used our wiring chart to identify the brake wire and the parking light wire, and we've put T-taps on them too. Next, we want to plan on where we're going to stow the remote start brain. Then we'll measure and trim our wires accordingly. Once the wires are all trimmed to length, we'll attach the male spade connectors that are going to plug into all the T-taps we've installed. Use your tip sheet to match the wires from the remote start to the correct color wires in the vehicle. Once the main ignition harness connections have been made, make the rest of the connections as called out on your tip sheet. Now that all the remote start connections are complete, the next step is to make the bypass connections. The bypass is what allows you to remote start your car without having to leave a key in the vehicle. Again, specific vehicles will vary, but the transponder plug is usually found in the general vicinity of the key cylinder. Your tip sheet will provide you with this information too. Make the bypass connections according to the instructions on your tip sheet. When doing bypass connections, don't use the T-taps. A direct wire-to-wire connection is required. Soldering is the best method, but wrap and tape is also acceptable. Your tip sheet contains instructions and diagrams on how to properly wrap and tape wires. Once all of your bypass connections are made, tape up the transponder harness and plug it back in. Now we'll make the rest of our connections. Many bypasses have a data link plug that directly connects the bypass to the remote start. We'll also connect the remaining wires that need to go into the car: the parking light wire, the brake wire. Our tip sheet tells us which wires in the car to connect to. If your remote start comes with its own remotes, you'll need to run the wire for the antenna. Pull down the trim gasket that holds the headliner in place and tuck the antenna wire underneath. Before mounting the antenna, we'll test the system to make sure everything is functional. When we press the start button on the remote fob, the ignition will turn on, you'll see your dash lights come on, and then the car will start. Once all the functions of the system have been tested, find a good location to stow the remote start brain. You'll want to find someplace where the wires don't get in the way of the steering column, the brake pedals, or any other moving parts. Stow the brain. Gather all your wires and bundle them either using electrical tape or zip ties. Secure the wires so they can't move once the vehicle is reassembled. Test the system one more time. Mission accomplished. Remote start systems from my pushcart also include free technical support. If you should encounter any trouble doing your installation, feel free to either call or email, and one of our expert techs will be glad to assist you. Our tech support hours are Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 Arizona time. Thanks, and happy installing.